There's nothing quite like watching your dignity get crushed in front of strangers who'll never remember your name. For Eli Ramirez, that moment came in a glass-walled boardroom where tech CEO Avery Sinclair dismissed his engineering experience like it was worth nothing. 3 days later, her mansion was burning, and his 9-year-old daughter was begging him not to go back inside. But Eli had been a firefighter for 15 years before unemployment knocked him down. Some things you never forget, even when pride tells you to walk away. He pulled Avery from those flames, and the headlines called him a hero. What they didn't know was that saving her life would force them both to face the deeper fires they'd been running from. Two broken people, thrust together by tragedy, discovering that sometimes the person who hurts you most becomes the one you're meant to heal. Can redemption bloom from the ashes of humiliation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning alarm pierced through the thin walls of the Ballard apartment at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Eli Ramirez had set it to ring. He'd been awake anyway, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a question mark fitting, since his entire life had become one giant question with no clear answer. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchen, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing over the past 18 months of unemployment. "Daddy," Sophie's voice drifted from the bedroom they shared, soft and drowsy. At 9 years old, she had the kind of intuition that came from watching her father struggle in silence, reading his moods like weather patterns. "Just getting ready for that interview, Mija," Eli called back, pulling on his one good shirt, the navy blue one Maria had bought him for their anniversary 3 years ago, before the cancer. Before everything changed. The apartment was small but clean, every surface maintained, with the precision of someone who had learned that order was sometimes the only thing you could control. Eli had arranged Sophie's art supplies in neat rows on the kitchen table, her colored pencils organized by spectrum. Her latest drawing was taped to the refrigerator, a stick figure in a red helmet standing next to a fire truck, with "My Hero Daddy" written in purple crayon across the top. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her dark hair sleep-tousled, clutching the worn, stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since her mother died. "Are you nervous?" Eli knelt to her level, straightening the collar of her pajamas. "A little, but you know what Mama used to say about butterflies in your stomach. They're just getting ready to help you fly," Sophie finished, managing a sleepy smile. The truth was, Eli hadn't felt much like flying lately. The Seattle job market had been brutal for an ex-firefighter with a bachelor's in engineering who'd been out of the corporate world for 15 years. Most human resources departments saw the gap in his resume and moved on to the next candidate. They didn't see the man who had saved 43 lives during his career, who had earned commendations for bravery, who had rebuilt engines and designed safety protocols in his spare time. The therapy schedule was pinned to the corkboard above the kitchen counter, a grid of appointments that cost more than their monthly rent. Sophie's occupational therapy, speech therapy, and counseling sessions, all necessary, all expensive, all reminders of how the accident that had claimed Maria's life had also left their daughter with challenges that insurance barely covered. "Mrs. Chen is picking you up at 8, Eli said, buttering Sophie's toast in perfect squares the way she needed them. "Remember the rules about the car ride? Seatbelt first, then count to 10 before we start moving," Sophie recited. "And if I feel overwhelmed, I can ask to stop and breathe." That's my girl. Next door, the Chens were already bustling about their morning routine. David Chen had been Eli's partner at Station 19, before the department cuts had forced them both to find new paths. David had landed a job with a private security firm. Eli had been less fortunate. But David's wife, Linda, had become Sophie's unofficial grandmother, picking her up for school and watching her after therapy sessions without ever making it feel like charity. At 7:30, Eli stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 4th time. The man looking back at him was 42 years old, but felt ancient. His black hair was threaded with silver now, and lines had etched themselves around his brown ice knot from laughter, but from the weight of carrying too much alone. Still, he was clean-shaven and presentable, his shoulders squared with the posture of someone who had faced down flames and lived to tell about it. The job was at Sinclair Technologies, a company that had made headlines for its innovative approach to urban safety systems. Their fire suppression technology was being implemented in cities across the country, and they needed someone with real-world experience to consult on their latest products. On paper, Eli was perfect for the position. In reality, he knew he was competing against candidates with MBAs and corporate experience, people who spoke the language of quarterly reports and market penetration. "You've got this, Daddy," Sophie said, hugging his legs as he prepared to leave. "Remember, you're the bravest person I know." The words hit him harder than she could understand. Brave. He'd been called that before, back when bravery meant running into burning buildings. Now it meant walking into boardrooms where his working-class accent and calloused hands marked him as different, where his 15-year gap in corporate experience felt like a chasm he couldn't bridge. The bus ride to downtown Seattle took 45 minutes, giving Eli time to review his notes and practice his talking points. He'd researched Sinclair Technologies thoroughly, memorizing their product lines and recent acquisitions. The company was headed by Avery Sinclair, a woman who had inherited the business from her father and transformed it from a small safety equipment manufacturer into a billion-dollar enterprise. At 38, she was known for her brilliance and her ruthlessness in equal measure. The Sinclair Technologies building dominated 3 blocks of downtown Seattle, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. Eli had driven past it countless times during his firefighting career, responding to calls in the surrounding area. Now he was walking through its gleaming lobby, past abstract sculptures and digital displays, showcasing the company's achievements. "Mr. Ramirez?" The receptionist's smile was practiced, but not unkind. "Miss Sinclair will see you in conference room A. It's on the 42nd floor." The elevator ride felt eternal. Eli checked his reflection in the polished steel doors, straightened his shoulders, and reminded himself why he was here. Sophie's therapy, the overdue rent, the chance to use his knowledge and experience to make a difference again. Conference room. A was a temple to corporate success, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay. The long table was surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Eli's monthly income. At the head of the table sat Avery Sinclair, and she was nothing like the professional photos on the company website. She was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and auburn hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her charcoal suit was tailored to precision, and her pale green eyes held the kind of intelligence that could cut through pretense like a blade. She was flanked by 3 other executives, all in their 30s, all looking like they'd stepped from the pages of a business magazine. "Mr. Ramirez," Avery said, not rising from her chair. "Please, sit." Eli took the chair across from her, noting how the sun from the windows created a natural spotlight effect, making him feel exposed while keeping her partially in shadow. It was a power play, subtle but effective. "I've reviewed your application," she continued, opening a folder that contained his resume. 15 years as a firefighter, bachelor's degree in engineering from the University of Washington. Impressive in its way. The phrase, "in its way," hung in the air like smoke. Eli forced himself to smile. "Thank you. I believe my hands-on experience with fire suppression systems and emergency response protocols could bring valuable insight to your safety technology division." "Valuable insight," Avery repeated, her tone suggesting she was tasting the words and finding them wanting. "Tell me, Mr. Ramirez, what makes you think that knowledge gained from—" She glanced at his resume. "Responding to house fires and cat-in-tree rescues translates to developing cutting-edge technology for urban environments." One of the other executives suppressed a snicker. Eli felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice steady. "With respect, Mrs. Sinclair, I've responded to high-rise fires, chemical plant explosions, and multi-vehicle accidents. I've seen firsthand how safety systems fail under pressure, and I've designed modifications that have saved lives. Modifications, Avery said, leaning back in her chair, to existing systems. We're not looking for someone to patch holes, Mr. Ramirez. We're looking for innovation. Innovation comes from understanding real-world applications, Eli replied, his voice gaining strength. I've studied your thermal imaging integration system. It's impressive technology, but in actual fire conditions, smoke density can interfere with the imaging algorithms. I've developed workarounds that... Mr. Ramirez, Avery interrupted, her voice sharp as winter wind. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we're not running a charity here. This position requires someone who can think beyond the limitations of manual labor and emergency response. Someone who understands the complexities of modern business. The words hit like a physical blow, manual labor, as if saving lives was somehow less valuable than creating PowerPoint presentations. Eli looked around the table, seeing the smug expressions of the other executives, and felt something inside him crack. I understand, he said quietly, standing from his chair. Thank you for your time. As he walked toward the door, Avery's voice followed him. Mr. Ramirez, good luck with your future endeavors. I'm sure you'll find something more suitable to your skill set. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into hell. Eli's hands shook as he pressed the button for the lobby, and he caught his reflection in the steel doors again. The same man who had entered the building an hour ago, but somehow diminished, as if Avery Sinclair's words had actually made him smaller. Outside, Seattle's autumn air felt like a slap after the climate-controlled perfection of the office building. Eli walked 2 blocks before finding a coffee shop where he could sit and process what had just happened. He ordered a black coffee, no fancy additions he couldn't afford, and found a corner table. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda Chen. Sophie did great in therapy today. She drew a picture of you getting the job. How did it go? Eli stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, still waiting to hear. He couldn't bring himself to crush Sophie's hope just yet. There would be time for that conversation later when he got home and had to explain why Daddy wouldn't be starting a new job on Monday. Why they'd have to figure out another way to pay for her therapy sessions. Why the stick figure drawing of her hero daddy might need to come down from the refrigerator. The coffee shop was filled with the usual mix of freelancers and students, people who seemed to have figured out how to navigate this new economy while he remained stranded in the old one. Eli pulled out his phone and opened the job search app, scrolling through listings that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Seeking dynamic individual with proven track record in customer engagement and brand optimization. Looking for passionate innovator ready to disrupt traditional paradigms. He closed the app and stared out the window at the people walking past, each one carrying their own stories of success and failure, hope and disappointment. Somewhere in this city, Sophie was probably telling her therapist about how her daddy was going to get a great job and everything would be okay. Somewhere else, Avery Sinclair was probably already interviewing the next candidate, someone with an MBA and a vocabulary that matched her expectations. The afternoon stretched ahead like an empty road. Eli finished his coffee and walked to the bus stop, joining the crowd of people heading home from their real jobs to their real lives. Tomorrow, he would start the process over again, updating his resume, searching for openings, crafting cover letters that made his experience sound relevant to employers who valued credentials over capability. But tonight, he would go home to Sophie and pretend that everything was fine. He would help her with her homework, read her a story, and tuck her into bed with the stuffed elephant that had belonged to her mother. He would be the father she deserved, even if he couldn't be the provider she needed. The bus pulled up, and Eli climbed aboard, settling into a seat near the window. As the city passed by in a blur of glass and steel, he tried to push Avery Sinclair's words from his mind. Manual labor. Suitable to your skill set. The condescension in her voice when she'd said, in its way. He had no idea that in just 3 days, he would be running toward flames again, not because it was his job, but because it was who he was. and the woman who had crushed his dignity in that boardroom would be the one whose life depended on his willingness to risk everything for someone who had shown him nothing but contempt. Some stories begin with hope, others begin with humiliation. This one began with both. 3 days after the interview, Eli was still carrying the weight of Avery Sinclair's dismissal like a stone in his chest. He'd managed to keep the worst of it from Sophie, but children have a way of sensing when their world is less stable than it appears. She'd been quieter than usual, more clingy during their evening routine, as if she could sense the invisible cracks spreading through their carefully constructed life. It was nearly midnight when the emergency radio scanner crackled to life in their apartment. Eli had kept the old device from his firefighting days, partly out of habit and partly because some instincts never fully die. The static-filled voice of the dispatcher cut through the quiet night like a blade. Structure fire, 2,847 Magnolia Drive. Multiple units responding. Possible occupant trapped. Magnolia Drive. Eli knew that Address-It was the exclusive cliffside neighborhood where Seattle's elite built their fortress-like homes overlooking Puget Sound. But something about the address nagged at him, a familiarity he couldn't quite place until he remembered the business articles he'd read while researching Sinclair Technologies. Avery Sinclair lived on Magnolia Drive. "Daddy?" Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "What's that noise?" "Just the radio, Mija. Go back to bed." But Eli was already reaching for his jacket, his body moving with the muscle memory of 15 years, responding to emergency calls. He told himself he was just curious, that he would drive by and see what was happening. It had nothing to do with the woman who had humiliated him in front of her colleagues. "Where are you going?" Sophie asked, more alert now. "Just for a drive. Mrs. Chen will watch you, okay?" 20 minutes later, Eli stood behind the police barricade, watching Avery Sinclair's modernist mansion burn against the night sky. The house was an architectural marvel of glass and steel, cantilevered over the cliff like a ship's prow cutting through darkness. Now it was a beacon of orange flame, smoke billowing into the starless sky. Fire Chief Martinez, Eli's former boss, spotted him in the crowd. "Ramirez, what are you doing here?" "Heard it on the scanner. Any casualties?" Martinez's expression was grim. "Owner's car is in the garage, but we can't get close enough to confirm if anyone's inside. The structure's compromised. The whole north wing is about to collapse." Eli studied the building with the practiced eye of someone who had made these assessments countless times. The fire had started in the lower level and was working its way up, but there was still a narrow window of opportunity. The main staircase would be impassable, but the service stairs on the east side might still be viable. What about aerial approach? "Ladder truck can't get close enough because of the cliff. We're treating it as a total loss and focusing on containment." Eli watched the flames dance behind the massive windows of what had probably been Avery's home office. Through the smoke and heat distortion, he caught a glimpse of movement, something pale against the interior darkness. A person. "Martinez, there's someone in there." "Where?" "Second floor, east wing, behind the glass wall." Martinez followed Eli's pointing finger and grabbed his radio. "Torres, do you have visual on the second floor, east wing?" "Negative, Chief. Too much smoke from this angle." But Eli had seen enough. The figure had been brief but unmistakable, someone moving, which meant someone alive and conscious. Trapped but alive. "I'm going in," Eli said, stepping toward the equipment truck. "Like hell you are. You're not even on the department anymore." "That's Avery Sinclair in there." Martinez paused. "The tech CEO? How do you know?" "Because I interviewed with her 3 days ago. She lives here. Her car's in the garage, and I just saw her moving around the second floor." The words hung between them for a moment. Martinez knew Eli better than most knew, that when he said he'd seen someone, he'd seen someone. Knew that Eli had never backed down from a rescue, even when the odds were impossible. "The structure won't hold much longer," Martinez said. "Even if you got in, the floor could collapse before you reached her." Eli was already pulling on borrowed turnout gear, his movements automatic despite the months away from the job. "The service stairs are still intact." I can reach the second floor, grab her, and be out in under 10 minutes. Ramirez. She might be unconscious from smoke inhalation. If she collapses, she won't make it to a window. Martinez looked at the burning house, then at Eli, calculating risks and probabilities the way fire chiefs had to do. Finally, he nodded. 10 minutes, then I'm pulling everyone back. Sophie's sleepy voice echoed in Eli's memory as he approached the building. You're the bravest person I know. He thought about Avery's dismissive tone, her casual cruelty. The way she'd made him feel small and worthless. He thought about walking away, letting someone else handle this. Instead, he stepped through the shattered glass door and into the inferno. The heat hit him like a physical force, even through the protective gear. Smoke filled his mask's viewport, turning the world into a hellscape of orange shadows and dancing demons. The service stairs were intact, but slick with condensation and debris. Eli climbed steadily, counting steps, monitoring his air supply, listening for the telltale sounds of structural failure. The second floor was a maze of contemporary furniture and abstract art, all of it now silhouetted against the glow of approaching flames. Eli moved methodically through the space, calling out despite knowing his voice wouldn't carry over the roar of the fire. He found her in what had been her home office, collapsed near a desk that probably cost more than his annual income. Avery Sinclair lay unconscious, her perfect business attire scorched and torn, her auburn hair singed. She looked smaller than she had in the boardroom, vulnerable in a way that cut through his anger like cold water. Eli checked her pulse weak, but steady and lifted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The return trip was more difficult, his vision obscured by smoke, the stairs now treacherous with water and foam from the suppression efforts. Behind them, he could hear the groaning of steel beams beginning to fail. They emerged from the building just as the east wing's support structure gave way, sending a cascade of glass and metal tumbling toward the cliff below. Eli laid Avery on the stretcher as paramedics swarmed around them, checking vitals and setting up oxygen. "Good work, Ramirez," Martinez said, clapping him on the shoulder, just like old times. But Eli wasn't listening. He was watching Avery's face as consciousness slowly returned, seeing the confusion and fear replace her usual composed mask. When her eyes finally focused on him, there was a moment of recognition, followed by something he couldn't quite identify: surprise, perhaps, or maybe gratitude. "The interview," she whispered, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. "Don't try to talk," the paramedic said, adjusting her oxygen mask. But Avery's eyes remained locked on Eli's. In them, he saw not the imperious CEO who had dismissed his worth, but simply a woman who had nearly died and was struggling to understand why the man she'd humiliated had risked his life to save her. The media arrived as they were loading Avery into the ambulance. News vans and camera crews materialized from the darkness like scavengers drawn to drama. Someone had already posted cell phone footage on social media, shaky video of Eli emerging from the burning building with Avery over his shoulder, backlit by flames, like a scene from an action movie. "Sir, can you tell us your name?" A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "I need to get home to my daughter," Eli said, pushing past the cameras. But the damage was already done. By morning, the footage would be viral, the headlines writing themselves. "Hero saves tech, CEO from burning mansion." The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had declared him unsuitable for meaningful work was alive because of skills she'd dismissed as manual labor. The drive home was surreal, the ordinary streets of Seattle feeling alien after the chaos of the fire scene. Eli's hands still shook slightly on the steering wheel, adrenaline slowly leaving his system. He'd pulled people from burning buildings before, but this felt different. Personal, complicated. Mrs. Chen was waiting in their apartment, having moved to the couch when the emergency scanner had awakened her too. "Everything okay?" she asked. "There was a fire. I helped out." She studied his soot-stained clothes and the scent of smoke that clung to him despite his shower. "Just like old times." Something like that. Sophie was still sleeping, one arm wrapped around her stuffed elephant, the other flung across the pillow where her mother used to lie. Eli stood in the doorway watching her breathe, thinking about how different this night could have ended, how close he'd come to not going at all. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Avery Sinclair. I wanted to thank you. Can we talk?" Eli stared at the message for a long moment before turning off his phone. Outside, Seattle slept on, unaware that the intersection of two lives had just shifted in ways that would ripple outward like concentric circles from a stone dropped in still water. Tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't ready to answer and complications he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, Sophie was safe in her bed, and a woman who had shown him nothing but contempt was alive because he'd chosen to be better than her worst assumptions about him. Sometimes that had to be enough. The Seattle General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, a combination Eli remembered too well from Maria's final months. He stood outside Avery Sinclair's room holding a small potted plant, nothing fancy, just a resilient succulent from the grocery store that Sophie had insisted on picking out herself. "She almost died, Daddy," Sophie had said that morning, arranging her crayons with unusual precision. "Mama always said flowers help people feel better." So here he was, feeling foolish and out of place in the sterile corridor, questioning his decision with every step. 3 days had passed since the fire, and the media circus showed no signs of slowing down. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests, reporters camping outside their apartment building, neighbors suddenly very interested in conversations they'd never bothered with before. The visitor log at the nurse's station told a story of corporate obligation flowers from board members, fruit baskets from business partners, get-well cards from employees who probably feared for their jobs if they didn't send them. Eli's name looked out of place among the corporate signatures and executive titles. Room 314 was private, naturally, with a view of Elliott Bay that probably cost more per night than most people's mortgages. Avery sat propped against pillows, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of her usual perfect chignon. The burns on her hands were wrapped in white gauze, and her face showed the pallor of someone still recovering from smoke inhalation. She looked up when he knocked, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Mr. Ramirez," she said finally, her voice still rough around the edges. "I brought this from my daughter," Eli said, setting the small plant on her bedside table. "She wanted to make sure you were okay." Avery stared at the succulent as if it were an alien artifact. "Your daughter?" "Sophie. She's 9. She has a theory that plants help people heal faster." "And what's your theory, Mr. Ramirez?" The question caught him off guard. In the boardroom, she'd spoken to him like he was barely worth acknowledging. Now there was something different in her tone, not warmth exactly, but a kind of careful attention. "I think people heal when they're ready to," Eli said. "Sometimes they need help figuring out when that is." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Is that why you're here? To help me figure something out?" "I'm here because my daughter asked me to check on you. And because..." He paused, struggling with words. "Because what happened in that interview doesn't matter when someone's life is on the line." Avery was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same intensity she'd shown in the boardroom, but without the predatory edge. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "You don't owe me anything. I was unnecessarily cruel during your interview. Unprofessional. I let my own frustrations cloud my judgment about your qualifications." Eli felt a flash of anger at the clinical language. Frustrations, judgment, as if his humiliation had been merely a minor miscalculation on her part. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why were you cruel? What did I do to deserve that?" Avery's fingers picked at the edge of her blanket, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with her usual composed demeanor. "You didn't do anything. That's not how it works." "Then how does it work?" She was quiet for so long that Eli began to wonder if she'd decided not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When you've spent your entire life proving you're worthy of respect, sometimes you forget that other people are fighting the same battle." The honesty in her words surprised him. This wasn't the ice-cold CEO who had dismissed his experience as manual labor. This was someone else entirely, someone who looked as lost as he'd felt walking out of that boardroom. "The news crews have been calling you a hero," Avery said, changing the subject. "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed doing. Most people would have walked away. After how I treated you, most people would have felt justified in walking away." Eli thought about that moment outside the burning house, the brief temptation to let someone else handle the rescue. Maybe, but that's not who I want my daughter to think I am. Something shifted in Avery's expression, a softness he hadn't seen before. "Tell me about her, Sophie." For the next 20 minutes, Eli found himself sharing stories he rarely told about Sophie's artwork, her struggles with social situations, her unwavering belief that her father could fix anything, about the way she arranged her toys in perfect lines and how she needed exactly 4 minutes to transition between activities, about her laugh, which was bright and rare and worth every sacrifice he'd made. Avery listened without interruption, asking occasional questions that showed she was really paying attention. When he mentioned Sophie's therapy schedule, she frowned. "That must be expensive." "We manage," Eli said, though they both knew it was only partly true. "The fire investigation is ongoing," Avery said after another pause. "But preliminary reports suggest it was electrical, old wiring in a house that was supposed to be state-of-the-art. Insurance will cover it? Eventually. But that's not the point." She looked out the window at the bay, where ferries moved like white insects across the grey water. "I've lived in that house for 8 years, and I'm not sure I knew a single one of my neighbors. I had the best security system money could buy, but when it mattered, none of that helped. What helped was a man I'd treated like garbage, choosing to run toward a burning building instead of away from it." The raw gratitude in her voice made Eli uncomfortable. He'd been raised to help people without expecting recognition, and the media attention felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. "I should let you rest," he said, standing. "Will you come back?" The question came out quickly, as if she'd surprised herself by asking. "If you want me to." "I do." Walking back through the hospital corridors, Eli tried to process what had just happened. The woman in that room bore little resemblance to the one who had humiliated him 3 days ago. Which one was real? Or were they both real, different facets of someone more complicated than he'd assumed? The lobby was filled with the usual hospital chaos, families in crisis, medical staff moving with purposeful urgency, the quiet desperation that hung over places where life and death decisions were made daily. Eli had spent too much time in hospitals over the past few years, first with Maria and then with Sophie's various appointments. His phone buzzed with yet another call from a reporter. He'd stopped answering them, but the voicemails kept coming. Someone wanted to do a feature story about everyday heroes. Someone else was producing a segment about unlikely rescues. They all wanted to fit his story into neat categories: working-class man saves wealthy CEO, former firefighter, can't resist the call to duty. None of them understood the complexity of standing in that hospital room, talking to a woman who had shown him cruelty and gratitude in equal measure. None of them would understand the guilt he felt about wanting to walk away, or the confusion he felt about her apology. The bus ride home gave him time to think, watching Seattle pass by in a blur of familiar landmarks. The Space Needle pointing toward grey clouds, Pike Place Market bustling with tourists and locals, the waterfront where he and Maria used to walk on Sunday afternoons when Sophie was small enough to carry on his shoulders. Mrs. Chen was waiting in their apartment with Sophie, helping her with homework at the kitchen table. They looked up when he entered, and Sophie immediately abandoned her math worksheet. "How is she?" Sophie asked, wrapping herself around his waist. "She's getting better. She wanted me to thank you for the plant." "Did she like it?" "She did. I think it made her feel less alone." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Eli sat at his laptop, scrolling through job listings with decreasing enthusiasm. The viral video of his rescue had generated hundreds of messages, some offering work, others just wanting to share their own stories of loss and heroism. Most of the job offers were clearly capitalizing on his moment of fame, temporary positions that would disappear as soon as the news cycle moved on. but buried among them was an email that made him pause. The sender was listed as A. Sinclair at sinclairtech.com. Mail to A. Sinclair at sinclairtech.com, sent just 2 hours ago. Mr. Ramirez, it read, I've been thinking about our conversation today and about the work we discussed during your interview. I may have been too hasty in my initial assessment. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss a consulting position that might make better use of your expertise. The pay would be substantial and the schedule flexible enough to accommodate your daughter's needs. Please consider it. A.S. Eli read the message 3 times, looking for hidden meanings or conditions. Was this genuine, or was it guilt-motivated charity? Did it matter? Sophie's therapy schedule stared at him from the refrigerator, a grid of appointments they could barely afford. Tomorrow there would be more bills, more job rejections, more nights of wondering how long they could keep their heads above water. He thought about Avery's words. When you've spent your entire life proving you're worthy of respect, sometimes you forget that other people are fighting the same battle. Maybe they were both fighting battles the other couldn't see. Maybe this offer was a chance for both of them to prove something to her, to him, to the world that had tried to reduce them to simple categories. Eli closed his laptop and walked to Sophie's room, standing in the doorway watching her sleep. Her drawing of the hero daddy was still taped to the wall above her bed, the red helmet bright against the white paper. Tomorrow, he would call Avery Sinclair and find out what she really wanted from him. Tonight, he would try to believe that sometimes second chances came from the most unexpected places. The consulting contract arrived via courier the next morning, bound in expensive leather that probably cost more than Eli's monthly grocery budget. Sophie watched from the kitchen table as he spread the documents across their small dining area, her cereal growing soggy while she studied his face for clues about their future. "Is it good news, Daddy?" Eli scanned the terms, trying to hide his surprise at the numbers. 6 months of consulting work at a rate that would not only cover Sophie's therapy, but actually allow them to save money for the first time in 2 years. The scope of work was deliberately vague consultation on safety technology, development, and implementation, but the compensation was crystal clear. "It might be, Mija. We'll see." The truth was more complicated. Accepting this offer meant working for the woman who had publicly humiliated him, entering a world where he'd always be the outsider who got lucky. But it also meant Sophie could continue her therapy. They could move to a larger apartment, maybe even start thinking about her college fund again. "Are you going to work with the lady you saved?" "Maybe. How would you feel about that?" Sophie considered this with the gravity that 9-year-olds brought to important decisions. "I think she probably learned something when you helped her. Mama always said people can change if they want to." Out of the mouths of babes. Maria had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of transformation, even in the most unlikely circumstances. It was one of the reasons she'd fallen in love with a firefighter who ran toward danger while others ran away. The Sinclair Technologies building looked different when Eli returned 3 days later. No longer an imposing fortress, but simply another workplace where people tried to solve problems and pay their bills. The security guard remembered him from the news coverage and waved him through with something approaching respect. Avery's office occupied a corner of the 45th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. She sat behind a glass desk that was meticulously organized, every document aligned with military precision. The burns on her hands were healing but still visible, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. "Mr. Ramirez, thank you for coming." She gestured to the sitting area near the windows, a more informal space with leather chairs and a coffee table that looked like it belonged in an art gallery. This was different from their last meeting. No power games, no positioning for psychological advantage. "I've reviewed the contract," Eli said, settling into one of the chairs. "The terms are generous. They're fair compensation for expertise we need." Avery poured coffee from a service that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "I want to be clear about something from the start. This isn't charity. I'm not offering you this position because you saved my life." "Then why are you offering it?" "Because I was wrong about you. Your insights about our thermal imaging system were accurate. We've had field reports of exactly the problems you identified. Your solutions were practical and implementable. She paused, looking out